Welcome to Section 2 of the ASC 710 training series. This section covers the 4 criteria that determine whether an employer must accrue a liability for compensated absences, and explains the difference between vesting and non-vesting absences, using vacation and sick leave as practical examples. By the end of this section, you will be able to list and apply the 4 criteria that trigger accrual under ASC 710. Explain why all 4 must be met at the same time. Distinguish vesting absences from non-vesting absences. Determine when a vacation policy requires accrual. And determine when sick leave accrual is required versus not required. These are core judgments that arise every period end. Under a SC 710, an employer must accrue a liability for compensated absences when all 4 specified criteria are met simultaneously. If even one criterion is not satisfied, no accrual is required. This is a conjunctive test, not a balancing test. The 4 criteria must be applied to each absence policy separately because different types of leave, such as vacation, sick leave, and personal days, may have different policy terms and therefore different accrual conclusions. The first criterion is that the employee's right to the compensated absence must be attributable to services already rendered. In other words, the employee has earned the time off through past work. If the benefit requires future service to unlock, criterion 1 is not met and no accrual is required at that point. Most vacation and annual leave policies satisfy this criterion because employees earn leave incrementally as they work, for example, 1 day per month of service. The second criterion is that the right to the compensated absence must either vest or accumulate. Vesting means the employee retains the value of the earned time off even if employment ends, typically through a cash payout on termination. Accumulating means unused time carries forward to a future period if not taken in the current period. Either condition satisfies criterion 2. If the policy is purely use it or lose it with no carryover and no payout on termination, criterion 2 fails and no accrual is required. The third criterion is that payment of the compensation is probable. It must be likely that the employee will either take the time off or receive a cash payment for the accrued balance. This criterion is generally satisfied for most vacation balances because employees typically do use their leave or receive payment on departure. The fourth criterion is that the amount of the liability can be reasonably estimated. This requires reliable data. Employee pay rates, accrued balances, and for larger populations, historical usage and forfeiture patterns. To summarize the 4 criteria test, all 4 must be satisfied simultaneously for accrual to be required. If the absence is earned by past service but forfeited on termination, criterion 2 fails and no accrual is needed. If the absence vests but the amount cannot be reliably estimated, criterion 4 fails and no accrual is needed. The analysis should be documented for each type of absence and revisited whenever the policy changes, because a policy amendment can change the conclusion. Vacation leave is the most common compensated absence that requires accrual because it typically satisfies all 4 criteria. Vacation is earned as the employee works, satisfying criterion 1. Vacation either accumulates year to year or is paid out when employment ends, satisfying criterion 2. It is probable the employee will use the time or receive payment, satisfying criterion 3. And vacation balances and pay rates are readily available from HR systems, satisfying criterion 4. Vacation accrual is therefore required under virtually all standard vacation policies. Not every vacation policy leads to the same accounting conclusion. A policy where vacation accumulates and is paid out on termination clearly requires accrual because vesting is present. A policy where vacation accumulates but forfeits after 2 years still requires accrual for the accumulated balance, with a reduction for expected forfeitures. A pure use-it-or-lose-it policy with no carryover and no payout on termination fails Criterion 2, so no accrual is required. The specific terms of each policy must be read carefully before reaching a conclusion. Most sick leave policies in the United States do not require accrual under ASC 71010. Sick leave does satisfy Criterion 1 because it is earned by service. However, most sick leave policies fail Criterion 2 because unused sick days are forfeited when employment ends and do not carry forward in any meaningful way. Criterion 2 failure is enough to eliminate the accrual requirement. The exception is when a company's policy explicitly pays out unused sick days on termination or allows sick days to convert into vacation. In those cases, all four criteria are met and accrual is required. The sick leave analysis has become more complex as an increasing number of U.S. states have enacted mandatory paid sick leave laws. In jurisdictions where the law requires unused sick leave to accumulate or to be paid out, the legal entitlement creates an accumulating or vesting right that may satisfy Criterion 2. This means the four criteria test must be applied separately for each state where the company has employees, and the conclusions must be revisited whenever state laws change. A policy that was not accrued previously may require accrual after a legislative change. Let us review the key takeaways from this section. Accrual for compensated absences under a SC 71010 is required only when all four criteria are met simultaneously. Criterion 2, which requires the absence to vest or accumulate, is the most common differentiator between absence types that require accrual and those that do not. Vacation leave almost always requires accrual. Sick leave usually does not, unless the policy specifically provides for vesting or accumulation. Each absence policy must be analyzed separately, and conclusions must be reassessed whenever the policy terms change. Thank you for completing Section 2 on the four criteria for compensated absences.